Thank you. Um, so again, we have had a little bit of coming and going during the break, which is great. Just summing up for newcomers, we've just had a presentation about the multi-level governance dynamics of robust crisis governance. We talked a little bit about the kinds of clubs or forums of actors that have helped countries and local areas to come through the COVID-19 crisis. We now turn to an up-and-coming superstar, I would say, Stephen Nemec from the Estonian team from Taltech. Stephen has had the cruel job of handling one of the most in vogue concepts in public administration, the hybridity of different forms of governance. I say it's a cruel task because this concept is very much in vogue, but also very slippery. But Stephen has and his team have conducted great research into how hybridity actually plays a specific role in crisis responses. And so we look very much forward to hearing your take on this, Stephen. Welcome to the floor.
Okay, that's definitely very high praise. No pressure at all. Okay, let's first try to get the first step done. Okay, I think now my slide is visible. So thank you, Rasmus, for this introduction. It is indeed a bit of a in vogue and a very popular concept, which we will now be delving to and hopefully add a bit of clarity, deconstruct it, as well as provide some tools and tips with regards to how to utilize it. So to everyone else, thank you for coming. My name is Stephen Mick. I'm from Tallinn University of Technology, and alongside my members of my work package, we have focused on the topic which is presented today, titled Governing in Times of Polycrisis, Fostering Robustness Through a Hybrid Toolbox. So from the start, we have ticked off a number of concepts and created additional conceptual ambiguity. And now what I'm going to try to do today in 20 minutes is deconstruct it a bit to highlight how we have actually gone about tackling this difficult topic. Now, first, let me see if... Okay. First, I would quickly jump back to the brilliant presentation by Jakob, who highlighted the concept of turbulence. Now, I won't reiterate what he has already highlighted, but I will complement it a bit. So the reason why this project also tries to focus on the concept of hybridity is because one thing that Jakob did highlight is that there is a constant pressure on public sector organizations to not only adapt to existential threats in crisis, but also everyday challenges with regards to the lack of trust in public institutions, with regards to balancing austerity reforms together with the expectations of citizens to provide more. So these are these kinds of everyday tensions that actually occur in public sector organizations. And this is something that was very poignantly highlighted by a lot of people whom we gather data from as putting out fires. I really like this concept because it kind of shows you the mind frame that different people put themselves into when they actually tackle this crisis context. And I think this kind of overlapping or polycrisis nature that the public sector organizations and practitioners face today was reflected in an interview that I heard of a member of the operative staff in the Estonian Police and Border Guard Board. So when he was asked to actually set the different crises, like the phases to highlight them, he outlined that actually for them, the COVID crisis ended on the 24th of February, 2022. Why? Because then we shifted from this crisis to the next crisis. So as you can see nowadays, it's not anymore about tackling a crisis, then recovering from it, having a period of stability, as Jakob said. It's more about shifting priorities, shifting values, putting your limited resources on the next crisis, the next existential threat that threatens to destabilize the existing administrative structure. So essentially what we have is we have public managers doing uncertain decisions in an uncertain environment with uncertain outcomes. And there have been multiple different suggestions, even some we have heard today with regards to, okay, how will it be possible for public managers to tackle it? We have the old school centralize until you can solve the problem, until you have control. But we also now have parallel paradigms with regards to inclusiveness. No, we don't understand the problem as well as we should, so we should include as broad a perspective as possible. Now, the issue there is that in this way, we tend to provide this kind of a normative model that you should reach, and then everything will be nice and happy and so on. And this is something that is increasingly more difficult to reflect it, not only in academia, but in practice as well, because the dynamic nature of crisis forces consistent shifts. And therefore, the approach that we are taking here in this work package is looking at through a lens of hybridity, how to maintain effectiveness and legitimacy with the limited resources and options available. Now, what is hybridity? Unfortunately, this won't be a 20-minute discussion on the benefits of having a physical and the digital format meeting altogether. So this is one of the issues that we have when facing hybridity, is that there is broad usage in the term. Now, on its base level, on its most general level, what hybridity is a mixture of seemingly conflicting and differentiating elements. And for a robust project, we have taken a very specific governance perspective where we focus on the differing coordinating logics within the governance structures. Now, what is coordinating logics? Essentially, it's nothing more or nothing less than simply finding the different ways of how to align two stakeholders towards a joint goal. In governance literature, we have three different ideal types. We have the command and control based approach with giving an order from one side to another to meet a joint goal. This is, in simpler terms, someone is telling, I want you to do this. However, there are more indirect forms as well with regards to finding an agreement on the goal and then creating an incentive system around it. This is something that during the COVID crisis, during peak phases, was quite well actually indicated by the R indicator, where actually the evening news tended to show the R indicator kind of like sports results, which highlighted as at a societal level how our society was actually responding to the crisis and whether some kinds of shifts were necessary. In essence, this is incentivizing the other stakeholder. You want to do this. And thirdly, it's the network-based approach, which is instilling the shared sense of responsibility and motivation to find some kind of a joint avenue from which to go further. In the COVID crisis, there were plenty of examples where public actors tried to focus on this sense of duty, sense of motivation. This was something that was well visible with emergency responders who put in overtime and extra hours to maintain the healthcare system from disintegrating apart. Now, why do these different logics matter? As was highlighted beforehand by Jakob, nowadays it is not about solving a crisis, but it is about maintaining core functions and values within your organization, within your policy field, and the administrative system through these fluctuating levels of turbulence. And how do we do that? We do that by using tools and measures that adhere to the different coordinating logics that are available to us. Now, what are tools and measures? These can vary. We have the formal legalistic dimension with regards to legislation, but here I will highlight immediately, legislation is not immediately hierarchy, because legislation can take multiple different coordinating forms where it can actually facilitate the creation of inclusive arenas. So it is about also the interpretation. So we have legislation with regards to substantive as well as framework legislation with regards to the actions and processes that should be undertaken, as well as the stakeholders, what kind of roles and responsibilities they have. But also we can have less formal, less legal forms through policy decisions or even strategic level emergency plans that both set the active composition and the roles that are to be undertaken in moments of crisis. Then there is also the structural dimension that is quite strongly linked, as you could perceive, with the formal legalistic dimension with regards to the existing emergency response structures, as well as complementing it through temporary committees and working groups. Also, what are some of the established processes within these emergency plans, for instance, for detection, for response and monitoring? And also, there is this kind of an organizational dimension with regards to the actors involved who actually put life into these structures that we have on paper. What is the available manpower that we are able to contribute to something? What are the existing networks that we have available to ask for further input or for help in maintaining some of the core processes? But also, what is the existing infrastructure that we have available? Do we have the necessary equipment, the necessary facilities? Do we have the digital infrastructure and know-how to design solutions in half a day to provide a grant or subsidy program to ailing sectors? And also, finally, it is something as simple as internal culture. How do we go about defining a problem, searching for alternatives, and deciding on them? And all of them in combination start to form this kind of a hybrid. Now, for the for the work that we did, as Tiziana also previously highlighted, we did do a bit of empirical work as well with regards to specific cases. Now, the country cases themselves were based on expert views and existing reports, which highlighted the different crises, but the primary emphasis was on the COVID crisis. And in the COVID crisis, we focused on key prominent policy measures, which were school closure and vaccination promotion, which were implemented through the peak phases of the COVID pandemic. Within the policy measures themselves, we tried to focus on the cross-organizational dynamics. We ended up with 19 cases of school closure and vaccination promotion in 9 countries. We tried to focus on both the national and the local level when we went through the cases to cover the different characteristics with regards to available options, as well as these choosing dynamics that I will go through later on this presentation. Now, if you're thinking what kind of example case we did, one of the example cases we did was, for instance, in the case of Estonia, was the Scientific Advisory Board. I like this picture because this picture is kind of like, it highlights well the role that an informal expert committee obtained actually over time in the Estonian context, because in the picture they kind of look like rock stars who have just exited the presidential residence, and that's what they actually were. And this did not happen through planned methods. This was something that over time developed as the different dynamics interplayed with them together. Namely, prior to the COVID pandemic, actually expert engagement was quite unstructured, and there was actually limited experience on the administrative level with regards to engaging experts, and there was no formal framework with the emergency response structures to include expert advice within the decision making. However, during the initial stages of the crisis, it became abundantly clear how unprepared with regards to the ability to actually analyze through the different knowledge sources that were coming in, how unprepared the public sector itself was. So it created quickly this in an ad hoc manner, this kind of a expert committee to operate alongside the central government. And this did not only bring positive dynamics, it went through its fair share of hurdles as well, because as it was created, no one actually defined clearly the roles, which created significant tension, as well as issues and questions of legitimacy. However, the positive dynamics instilled within it with regards to trust-based relations on the one side and mandating the framework through government authority on the other side resulted in highly positive experience with regards to incorporating expert advice within the central government level. Now, on the local government level, we also try to focus on these differing characteristics with regards to both positive as well as somewhat more challenging environments. And one interesting case that was local level case that was highlighted was in the Netherlands with regards to designing and implementing a vaccine strategy in a Christian Orthodox fishing community. Now, why this was a challenge was because this is a local community that is heavily based on traditions and community-based values, where national level instructions and guidelines regarding closure as well as distancing is not compatible with the functioning of this specific local community. What this resulted in a need policy to conduct the process of policy reframing. Why? Because the local government perceived that they would be unsuccessful if they try to directly implement the guidelines, even if they somewhat customize to the local level the guidelines. So what they did is they started doing a balancing act between compliance and legitimacy. And how they managed to maintain it is through making use of the resources available already at the local level with the trust capital that has already been built by some of the local actors, including general practitioners, and through that, enabling them to actually conduct the vaccination admission by creating as easy of a logistical supply as possible. And this highlights also how another form of hybrid can occur through reframing top-down hierarchical guidelines and customizing it through local collaborations entailing public, private, and societal actors. Now, what did these cases show us? They showed us that combining, so forming hybrids can result in both positive and negative results. And this happens with all of the different kinds of combinations. So this starts to show us the challenge of providing concrete suggestions with regards to a crisis response. Namely, each potential suggestion has its own trade-offs that you have to consider. So if we go forward and start to consider the different combinations with regards to hierarchy and network, what are the possible assets? So on the one side, you may have expedited speed and clarity in the decision making and having inclusiveness with bringing on additional perspectives for the decision making. So this is something that I just highlighted with the scientific advisory board, but this happened in other countries as well, where the federal level or the national level started including other actors to better perceive, to better analyze the problem, as well as offer up the potential solutions. However, this does not mean that it always works. There can also be moments of confusion with regards to the roles, inclusiveness issues due to the inclusion rules within a specific venue, or even duplication, because one side does not see a national level or a local level venue as legitimate, so they try to provide one of their own. This is something that could be seen in the refugee crisis, where you start having parallel implementation venues through NGOs, but also during the COVID crisis, which I once again highlighted with regards to confusion, the role of bringing in ad hoc expert committees, or also the inability to actually maintain some practices because there is a lack of legitimacy perceived in it. However, once you have managed to facilitate the positive dynamics, what it does is it establishes the flexibility for public administrations to shift. Now, secondly, if we talk about hierarchy of markets, now, what is the potential positive aspect? It can rapidly reshape conditions and engage through it new perspectives and capacities. This can happen with the inclusion of private partners to provide the necessary infrastructure or conduct necessary processes. But what is the challenge is this requires us to be able to clearly articulate the goals as well as the incentives, the indicators for it. So if we do not manage that, we may just ignore the underlying problem and we may overshot it or we may miss it entirely, where the capacity building does not match with the demand of the other stakeholders or the citizens themselves, which will then result in issues of effectiveness as well as issues of legitimacy. However, distilling the positive dynamics between hierarchy and market can provide the public administrations the option for being modular, for having the space of the defined goal that establishes the framework, but having the autonomy within it to choose the necessary, the relevant tools, the best options for the situation. Now, finally, with regards to market and networks, what this can instill is the spaces for actors to innovate and come up with new creative solutions that think outside the box and move beyond the established paradigms, the established frameworks that we have. This is something that we could see in moments of crisis where private and societal actors try to come together and provide new solutions, whether it be community-based actions to alleviate some of the psychological impact from the closures that were necessitated during the peak phase of COVID, but also with regards to the initial phases at the start with these kinds of hackathons that try to solve the crisis, try to look at it from another perspective. However, this is not only rainbow and sunshine, because market and network itself can have an issue where it tries to establish itself within a framework, within rules, where it's simply not compatible with it. And therefore, instead of creating this innovative space, it instead maintains the rigidity that is present. And this can completely curtail any kind of creative endeavors. However, if you manage to create the creative endeavors, it can foster some of the creativity and innovation that is necessary for moving beyond the established frames and rethinking what we have and how we can solve the problem. Now, why are these different dynamics necessary to highlight? Here is once again moving back to the hybrid way of thinking. Namely, it's not one specific configuration of tools, policy tools, and measures that make for a good crisis response. It is the ability to combine and move from one configuration to another that actually provides the ability to bounce back from the crisis and maintain the core functions. Now, does this happen in a vacuum? Absolutely not. So why is this problematic? Namely, we have to consider the available options that we have, the dynamics of the chosen options, and how it all plays together with the crisis environment. So this is one of the reasons why it is very difficult to actually make the necessary decisions within the crisis moments. So what do I mean by that? With regards to the available options, we have both enablers and limiters. So what impedes our ability to make decisions? For instance, past experiences with crisis. It gives us an initial point of reference. However, something that we saw in the country reports itself as well was that they highlighted the existence of emergency plans, but its complete inadequacy for the COVID crisis. Why? Because these are designed on the basis of a previous crisis, but not designed according to this crisis. And this is how it can start to limit our analytical capacity with regards to the stakeholders that we should be engaging and including within the decision-making as well as the implementation process. Linked to this is the existing emergency structures with regards to what is the mutual framework for stakeholders, who are the responsible actors, what is the processes that we should be conducting during the crisis response. However, what it also can do is it can establish the core functions and values that we have for a crisis, but not the crisis on hand. It can miss the value prioritization that is present for the society at this moment in time. And therefore, it can create issues when they start to implement the plan according to the existing emergency structure. Thirdly, it is the relationship with all of the stakeholders. Why is it relevant? Because it establishes the baseline for the effectiveness and legitimacy with regards to who we should include and how do we make the decisions acceptable, and how is this subject to shifts during the moments of crisis. And finally, it is the existing capacities and how we're supposed to rethink them. do we have the redundancies present within our administrative structures to redesign, to reshift the resources that we have? Do we have the ability to retrain our staff to actually conduct the new tasks or not? One element is the available options, and the second element is the options that we have chosen themselves. What are the implications of this toolbox that we have decided to design? The overall goal, do we look for short-term mitigation that we have to respond to it as urgently as possible? However, do we also consider the long-term viability? Sometimes the decisions that you make with regards to, for instance, emergency responders doing the overtime, the additional working hours, this can create exhaustion and fatigue that does not make it a viable option moving forward in the long run, nor does it make possibly a legitimate option for the next crisis. The second link to this now is the demands for the individuals and organizations. Have we established clarity with regards to the role, flexibility in shifting it, and as I mentioned beforehand, have we managed to create a framework where we can manage this kind of fatigue through a process of activation and deactivation? And finally, the lesson drawing ability itself. Do we only focus on putting out this fire, or are we considering also the potential options available for us for the subsequent fires? Now, this happens through two important elements. First, it is admitting failures. This is something that we have seen during post-crisis period with regards to the delegitimation of some of the measures and instruments utilized, as well as restrictions implemented by some of the executive agencies, but also the positive practices. What are the key takeaways that we have taken from this crisis? For instance, these expert collaborations or these ad hoc networks between the different public, private, and societal actors. So how do we manage to adopt them into our current governance structure now moving forward? Now, to conclude this long talk about hybridity, there is one takeaway I would like you to remember. There isn't a single best solution or practice. Everything is dependent on the problem and context. Broad inclusion and quick response provide a lot of positive elements for effectiveness and legitimacy, but there can be situations where they can be also destructive and facilitate negative dynamics within the crisis response structure. What matters more is the flexibility and the agility to shift between one configuration to another, the ability to critically reflect upon and analyze the policy tools and measures that we use, and also our ability to move back on them and choose new alternatives in their place. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. There was you rooted sort of your lesson drawing here in a couple of examples that I thought were very illustrative. One member of the audience here, Andreas, is asking. So go back to this Estonian scientific advisory board, right? We were not all there in Estonia, so the rest of us don't know these guys. What was the hybrid element of them? You say they're not sort of truly an informal or a formal advisory board, or what was special about these guys?
So the Estonian case is quite interesting. This is something that I also highlighted with some of the issues initially in figuring out their roles. So essentially, the dynamics that occurred during their establishment is that the scientific advisory board actually adopted a larger role than simply providing expert policy advice. Namely, they obtained stronger legitimacy at times than the central government, and the central government was actually, instead of having an informed policy-making design where they take into consideration their suggestions and recommendations, they rather actually adopted it in some instances one-to-one, because they actually experienced legitimacy issues and pressures to adhere to the guidelines of the scientific advisory board. So it actually developed a stronger role than was initially planned, and also alongside simply providing informal advice. They became actually the disseminators of the policy decisions themselves as well. Why? Because they initially informally adopted the role of spokespersons, and later on, because their initial role, it became standardized, where they were actually already the spokespersons, the more legitimate spokespersons for in the government to citizen dimension than the central government itself, actually. So this is why it deviated somewhat from this standard policy advice consultation consultation dynamics that we actually usually can see, and adopted a larger role. So it's an excellent point, yeah. And that's why it started adopting this more hybrid nature, where at one moment there was a more stronger emphasis on hierarchy, where the central government looked also towards the use of scientific advisory board as a legitimation measure. But at other times, the scientific advisory board, their discussions, their decisions, that was the core emphasis of the decision itself. So it shifted from a more dominant hierarchy network to actually a more network dominant hierarchy network dynamic.
This is very interesting to me, at least, and probably Andreas also, because we are both Danes. This was because it's a very different dynamic than what happened in Denmark, I think, where we saw just one example that we looked at in our report, which is quite also famous in Denmark, is the fact that there was a formal advisory body in place in Denmark that was supposed to provide basically all scientific policy advice on the pandemic in any case where a pandemic was ever going to happen. That was sort of the pre-planned role. But these guys were actually too liberal for the tastes of the central government. So they were supplemented by another organization, and they were overridden because our government wanted to take the sort of maximum risk approach, right? What is the worst thing that could happen, and we want to respond to that. So that was quite sort of, it was hybridity in the other direction, you could say, right? Where you have the government starting to sort of purchase the scientific advice that they need. So how do you see any reflections there? I mean, because your government seems to have stepped into the background more, and why is that?
Okay, so why is that? Is a difficult question, because this is this would require going into the motives of each individual actor. Now, with regards to taking a step back, there was a clear perception with regards to what kind of a problem that we actually have. So this is something that I did not reflect in the presentation, but at times actors can actually perceive whose responsibility also the specific crisis should be, whether we are dealing with a political issue or whether we are dealing with something that should be actually solved by experts. And here, actually, the Estonian government also took a relatively strong stance that this is actually a crisis where experts should be the ones guiding the decisions that we are making, and we are simply facilitating the political knowledge with regards to what the decision-making dynamic should be, as well as providing the necessary administrative structures with regards to the implementation of it. So this is one rationale that the Estonian government did. Now, one thing that I did mention in my previous answer, why they also had to take this response, is that they were suffering from legitimacy issues. The legitimacy issues actually limited the ability of the central government to take the decisions and ensure citizen compliance as well. And the citizens already perceived the scientific advisory report as having significantly higher legitimacy. So it became easier for the government to at times adopt a background role, because if they had contested the decisions of the scientific advisory board, they would have had a legitimacy challenge due to the conflict between the two parties, which would have been difficult to resolve in times of crisis. And also it would have been something that would have been very unattractive to solve during the time of crisis, where you already are under the pressure to provide quick enough decisions.
Super interesting. Yeah, so that's a kind of robustness in itself, you could say, right? This ability to let oneself play a slightly different role than one might have wanted to, right? I think there are probably quite a few politicians who would instinctively want to be in the front, right? But there is a kind of robustness in suppressing that ambition and playing with the pieces that work in the situation, right?
Absolutely. One of the elements that when we were studying from a hybrid perspective was also reflected was this was more on the local level, less on the central level, but what was also important was the ability of public actors to perceive their roles and shift accordingly. At some moments in a policy field, you may be the dominant actor who provides the guidelines, who provides the necessary resources, but in other stages, you may have less knowledge of the problem, less ability to come up with the solutions due to the lack of resources, as well as the issues with legitimacy. And at that moment, it may be beneficial also to actually trust upon private and societal actors to complement the limitations coming in. But it also necessitates a role shift where you have to be willing to actually rethink your role and readapt with, rather than giving top-down guidelines, you are willing to take in the input and listen and actually change accordingly.
Yeah. Well said. Let's see. I think our lesson from the previous session was that maybe our audience is mostly interested in hearing the presentations and maybe our own discussions a little bit. So we agreed that we would not wait too long to move on, unless there are pressing questions among the audience right now. I think where we landed here, Stephen, with this discussion of the scientific advisory board actually links very nicely up to our next also upcoming star, Chiara from Antwerp, who has the huge task of mapping interfaces of societal intelligence and how these have worked in various crises. So if let's see if we have no other questions, then I want to say thank you very much, Stephen, for this presentation, which was very enlightening, and I think this may go viral. That's my prediction. Let's see.